The long-awaited return, the silence of space was broken by a low hum, a signal faint but unmistakable. It had been years since humanity had disappeared from the galactic radar. The once vibrant communications with the alien species that had helped them were now long forgotten, as if humanity had vanished into the void. For the alien civilizations, it was a distant memory until now, deep within the command center of the Zarthian Empire. The screen flickered as a strange signal pulsed across the stars. It was a signal like none they had ever encountered. It was human. Can we trace it? Captain Varia of the Zarthian fleet asked, her sharp eyes narrowing at the screen. Her heart skipped a beat. The signal was old, too old to have come from a ship on a routine mission. It was a distress call, faint, but clear. The message was one word: humanity. The Zarthians had once assisted humanity in its darkest hour. They had shared their technology, their knowledge, and helped fight off a galactic invasion that threatened to wipe out the human race. The humans had been desperate then, their lives hanging by a thread. But after that war was won, humanity had vanished, and the Zarthians had returned to their peaceful existence. Now, the sudden reappearance of the human signal sent waves of unease through the command center. Varia knew the history too well. The humans were powerful when united, but they had always been unpredictable. Their brief alliance with the Zarthians had been a time of mutual respect, but no one had expected them to disappear so suddenly. Is it a distress call? Varia's second in command, Lieutenant Croth asked. He was younger, still learning the nuances of galactic politics, but he could feel the tension in the air. Not sure, Varia replied, but we can't ignore it. It's been years. Something's changed. The transmission was faint, coming from an uncharted star system. Varia made the decision in an instant. They would send a fleet to investigate. What? They discovered there could change the course of their entire galaxy. As the Zarthian fleet prepared to leave, the news spread like wildfire across the galaxy. The leaders of other alien factions began to take notice. Whispers about the humans' return began to spread, with some wondering if they were truly the allies they once were, or if they had something more dangerous in mind. Back on the flagship, Varia stood in front of the large view screen, looking at the star map. The path to the unknown system would take several days, but it was the only lead they had. She felt a mix of excitement and dread. She had always respected humanity, but she had never fully understood them. Their rapid rise from near extinction to becoming a galactic power had always been a mystery. The Zarthians had never known much about humanity's homeworld. They had shared knowledge, technology, and even some cultural exchange, but there was always a sense of distance between them. Now, as the fleet set course, a new sense of urgency filled the air. No one knew what the humans would be like after so many years. Had they remained allies, or had something else happened? Had they evolved into something else entirely? The ship's AI chimed in, breaking the silence. ETA, 3 days. Varia nodded, but said nothing. The countdown had begun. The fleet would arrive at the uncharted star system in 3 days. She couldn't shake the feeling that the answer they were about to find would be far from what anyone expected. Meanwhile, in the quiet of the Zarthian command center, Lieutenant Croth looked over at Varia. He had noticed the tension in her demeanor, the way her hand tightened around the edge of the console. "Do you think they're coming back to help us again?" he asked, his voice uncertain. Varia hesitated before answering, her gaze fixed on the stars outside. "I hope not. I fear that whatever humanity has become in all this time, It may no longer be what we once knew. The 3 days passed quickly for the Zardian fleet, and as they neared the mysterious star system, a sense of anticipation mixed with dread began to settle over the crew. What they would find was still a mystery, but one thing was clear: humanity's return had not been by chance. The questions were multiplying. Why now? Why, after all these years? As the fleet neared the system's outer edge, the signals grew stronger. It wasn't just one transmission anymore, it was a fleet-wide communication. Something was happening. The silence was broken. Humanity had not forgotten the Zarthians, and now they were ready to be heard. Captain Varia stood tall at the helm. The next few moments would reveal everything, or perhaps nothing at all. The tension was unbearable, and yet she knew that in these next few minutes, everything would change. Whatever they were about to face, they would have to face it together. The message they had received was only the beginning. Asterisk, the unexpected message: the Zarthian fleet dropped out of hyperspace, the stars stretching out in every direction as the massive ships aligned in formation. Captain Varia stood at the helm, her hands clasped behind her back, her eyes focused on the screen. This star system was silent to silent. No sign of life, no planets with active signals, only the faint pulse of the mysterious human signal coming from a nearby moon orbiting a dead world. "Can we get a better reading on that signal?" Varia asked, her voice sharp as the tension in the room mounted. She knew they were close. Too close. Lieutenant Croft leaned over his console, his face lit by the faint glow of the star map. "I'm trying, Captain. The signal's coming from the surface of the moon, some sort of artificial beacon. It's human." He glanced up at Varia, uncertainty in his voice. "It doesn't make sense. Why would they send a signal from here?" Varia's mind raced. The aliens had left humanity to their own devices after the war, unsure of their future, but this, it felt wrong. Why would they suddenly resurface after all this time? Was it a trap, or were they truly coming back as allies? A million questions swirled in her mind, but she couldn't find an answer. She made her decision. In an instant. "Prepare a landing party. We'll find out for ourselves." The landing was swift, the Zardian ship descending toward the moon's barren surface. The cold, desolate landscape stretched for miles, a world abandoned long ago, but something wasn't right. As the crew exited the ship, their boots crunching on the icy ground, they saw something unexpected. Structures, buildings, some broken, some still standing tall, as though left in a hurry. These were not ruins, they were signs of life. The beacon was still broadcasting its message, louder now, clearer. "Humanity is coming. We demand your surrender." The words hit like a punch in the stomach. This wasn't a plea for help, was a declaration. Humanity wasn't just coming back to visit. They were coming back to take control. "Captain," Lieutenant Croft said, his voice shaky as he pointed to a large structure up ahead. "It looks like there's something inside. It's not just a beacon. Someone, or something, is waiting for us." Varia's instincts told her to be cautious, but the intrigue was too much. The mystery of why humanity had returned demanded an answer. With a nod, she motioned for the team to follow. They moved forward, the eerie silence of the moon enveloping them, broken only by their footsteps and the hum of the beacon. Inside the structure, it was dark and cold. The walls were covered in strange symbols, human language, but twisted, as if altered over time. The air was thick with the smell of old technology, abandoned for years. And then they found it. A large console, still active. The screen flickered to life, and a voice, cold and emotionless, filled the room. "We are humanity. We've returned." It wasn't a message of hope or alliance. It wasn't a call for peace. This was a statement of intent. "We've rebuilt our forces. Our fleet has grown beyond your understanding. You helped us once, but that time has passed. Now you will obey." Humanity is reclaiming what was lost. The transmission ended abruptly, leaving the room in silence. Varia's heart pounded in her chest. She could feel the weight of the message, like a heavy fog settling. In the room, the words echoed in her mind, "You will obey." "What have we done?" Lieutenant Croth whispered, his eyes wide with shock. He had never known humanity to be this cold. "That was no plea for help," Varia said quietly, her voice steady but filled with dread. "That was a warning." As the Zarthian team stood in the dark room, the reality of the situation began to set in. Humanity wasn't just coming back, they were coming back as conquerors. The power they had once shared with the Zarthians was gone, replaced by something far more terrifying. Outside, the fleet began to move. Humanity's return had begun in earnest. No more alliances, no more grateful exchanges. The Zarthians were no longer allies, they were targets. Captain Croth said, staring at the console in disbelief. "We need to warn the others. They're not coming to talk, they're coming to take." Varia turned towards him, her eyes filled with a cold resolve. "We're not going anywhere. We need to find out how deep this runs. If humanity has truly changed, we need to understand why." Back aboard the fleet, the realization began to spread. The human signal wasn't just a beacon, it was a battle cry. The galaxy was about to witness the return of humanity in a way no one had expected, and Varia knew one thing for certain: there was no turning back now. The battle for the galaxy had begun, and it was humanity that was leading the charge. The fleet emerges. The Zarthian fleet hung in orbit around the barren moon, the massive ships casting long shadows across its desolate surface. The signal had been clear. Humanity was back, and they were no longer the desperate, struggling race they had once been. The galaxy had underestimated their power, and now humanity was about to make its return in a way no one could have foreseen. Captain Varia stood in the command center, her hands gripping the edge of her console as she stared out into the void. The Zarthian fleet had only moments ago received a communication from the human fleet, and the words were as chilling as they were unexpected. "We are here. Prepare to face our wrath." Varia's mind raced. What had happened to humanity in the years they'd been gone? Had they evolved into something darker, more powerful? And what had changed them into conquerors instead of allies? The silence in the command center was broken by the voice of Lieutenant Croth. "Captain, the human fleet is emerging from hyperspace. They're here." Various breath caught in her throat. She turned sharply to the view screen, her eyes scanning the stars. At first, there was nothing, just the familiar emptiness of space. Then, slowly, a massive fleet began to materialize, moving with purpose and precision. The ships were unlike anything Varia had ever seen before. They were sleek, powerful, and brimming with energy. Their sheer size alone was enough to send a wave of dread through her. "Can we make contact?" Croth asked, his voice tinged with both awe and fear. Varia shook her head. "They've cut off all communications. It's clear they're not here to negotiate. The human fleet didn't just appear. It arrived in force. Massive warships, their holes glowing with a deep, ominous light, began to take positions around the moon. It was as if the very stars themselves had darkened in response. For the first time in her career, Varia felt truly outmatched. On board the human flagship, Admiral Cyrus stood at the bridge, his eyes fixed on the monitor showing the alien fleet. His face was stone, devoid of emotion, but inside, a fire burned. He had watched as humanity struggled and fought for survival. Now, they were back not for peace, but for what was rightfully theirs. "Admiral," a voice from his communications officer interrupted his thoughts. "The Zarthian fleet has locked onto our position. They've made no attempt to communicate." Cyrus didn't flinch. He knew what they were thinking. The Zarthians, like everyone else, had believed that humanity was weak, a species that needed saving. But humanity had learned from its mistakes. They had learned how to fight, how to survive, and most importantly, how to take what was theirs. "Open a channel," Cyrus ordered coldly. "Let's give them the message." The communications officer hesitated for a moment, but complied, sending a signal to the Zarthian fleet. The message was brief and direct. "We are not here for your cooperation. We are here for your surrender." The words hung in the air like a curse, heavy and unforgiving. It was not an offer. It was a demand. Back on the Zarthian flagship, Captain Varia's heart raced as the transmission came through. The message was clear. Humanity was no longer the same species they had helped. They were no longer seeking allies, they were seeking dominance. "Captain," Lieutenant Croth said, his voice urgent. "The human fleet is powering up weapons. They're preparing to engage." Various thoughts flashed back to the years when humanity had been at their most vulnerable. The galaxy had been their enemy, but the Zarthians had helped them. Now, the very species they had once saved was returning to claim their place in the galaxy, and they weren't asking for permission. "We can't wait any longer," Varia said, her voice calm but firm. "We need to warn the others. Humanity is not here for peace, they are here for war." In the depths of space, humanity's fleet surged forward, its massive warships cutting through the stars with unmatched power. Admiral Cyrus stood at the helm, watching as his fleet took its position. The Zarthians were nothing but a distant memory to him, now just another obstacle in humanity's path to reclaiming the galaxy. "What about the other species?" one of Cyrus's officers asked. "Should we reach out to the others for support?" Cyrus turned, his eyes narrowing. "There is no one else. The galaxy abandoned us once. Now they will know what it means to cross humanity. We will take what is ours, and no one will stop us." As the human fleet positioned itself above the Zarthian fleet, a heavy silence filled the space between them. It was not just the silence of waiting, it was the silence of impending destruction. Varia knew the fight was coming, but the truth was, no matter how powerful her fleet was, they were facing something far more dangerous than they had ever imagined. Humanity had returned, and they were not the weak species they had once helped. They were strong, they were prepared, and they were ready to take back everything they had lost. The question now was simple. Would the Zarthians fight for their survival, or would they be the first to fall to humanity's wrath? The final shutdown. The darkened expanse of space was filled with the hum of power as humanity's fleet hovered over the Zarthian defenses. Captain Varia stood frozen in her command center, staring at the display screen where humanity's ship sleek and deadly loomed large. The message was simple. Humanity had returned, and they wanted what was theirs. The once powerful alliance between the Zarthians and humanity now seemed like a distant memory. nothing more than a footnote in the annals of history. The Zarthians were outmatched. Their weapons, their technology, nothing compared to the sheer force of the human fleet now in orbit. The silence of the galaxy felt deafening, as if even the stars themselves were holding their breath. "Captain," Lieutenant Croth said, his voice barely above a whisper, "they've locked on to our position. They're not going to wait much longer. What's our move?" Varia's mind raced. She knew that a direct confrontation was inevitable, but it didn't have to be this way. The humans had come back for one reason: revenge. Their message was clear, and yet there had to be a way to avoid the worst. But in her heart, she knew that negotiation was no longer an option. They had made their choice. Humanity was not here to ask for forgiveness. They were here to claim their power. "We're out of time," Varia said, her voice steady, though her mind swirled with doubts. "Prepare the fleet. Engage at will. We fight for survival." Admiral Cyrus stood at the bridge of his flagship, his eyes fixed on the Zarthian fleet. The time for words had passed. He had waited for this moment for years, the moment when humanity would no longer be a forgotten species, but one that would make the galaxy take notice. "Admiral, the Zarthians are moving. They've launched their attack," one of his officers reported, his voice tight with urgency. Cyrus barely acknowledged the words. His mind was focused on the task ahead. His fleet was ready, their weapons primed. He had seen what humanity could do when cornered. He had seen the strength, the resolve, the endless capacity to fight. He had seen their transformation. They were no longer a species in need of help. They were a force that the galaxy would never forget. "Deploy the fleets. We end this now." The Tweed battle erupted in an instant. The sky, once silent, now screamed with the sound of warfare. Energy blasts, laser beams, and missiles tore through the darkness as both fleets clashed. Humanity's ships moved like a single organism, precise, organized, and devastating. The Zarthians, though valiant, were overwhelmed. Their ships were powerful, but they were no match for the brutality and efficiency of humanity's forces. "Brace for impact," Varia shouted as her ship shuddered under the onslaught. She could feel the ship's systems straining, the hull groaning as the human firepower tore through their defenses. The Zarthian fleet fought back, their weapons firing with desperation, but it was clear the humans were unstoppable. Their technology was faster, deadlier, and more advanced than anything the Zarthians had ever faced. The Zarthian ships began to fall one by one, their shields flickering and collapsing under the relentless barrage of fire. "We can't hold them off much longer," Croth said, his voice filled with disbelief. They're not just fighting us, they're destroying us." Varia's face was grim. She knew the truth. The humans were no longer the species she had once helped. They were ruthless. And now they were determined to show the galaxy just how far they had come. Meanwhile, aboard one of the Zarthian flagship's sister ships, Lieutenant Croth glanced at the screen, his eyes wide with horror. The Zarthian fleet was disintegrating, and yet the human ships showed no signs of slowing down. There was no mercy. There was no room for negotiation. Captain Croth said urgently, "We can't win this. We need to retreat." Varia's gaze was cold, her resolve unshaken. "Retreat," she said, a slight edge to her voice. "There is no retreat. We stand our ground or we fall together." But as she spoke, the human flagship, massive and terrifying, opened fire on the fleet's central command vessel, sending a violent shockwave that rocked the entire ship. Varya was thrown forward as the ship's walls shook violently. Alarms blared in every direction. "Captain, we are taking critical damage," Croth shouted over the chaos. "We can't survive another round of fire like that." Varya's mind raced as the reality of their situation began to sink in. Humanity had returned with vengeance, and the cost of underestimating them was now clear. They weren't just fighting for survival, they were fighting to rewrite the galaxy's history. The Zarthian flagship's hull cracked under the pressure, and Varya knew it was only a matter of time before the ship would break apart. Their final stand had begun. They had come so far, yet now they were standing on the edge of oblivion. Back aboard the human flagship, Admiral Cyrus watched as the last of the Zarthian fleet fell. The galaxy had witnessed the rise of humanity, and there would be no forgetting. The battle was over, but the war was just beginning. "We've won," one of his officers said quietly, his voice almost reverent. Cyrus didn't smile. He didn't need to. He had seen the cost of this victory. It wasn't just a win in battle, it was the beginning of humanity's dominance in the galaxy. And now, as the enemy ships crumbled around them, he couldn't help but feel the weight of what they had become. The galaxy would never look at humanity the same way again. With their final strike, humanity had claimed victory. But what would the future hold now that they had shown the galaxy their true power? Would they become rulers of the stars, or would there be other forces waiting to challenge their reign? The answer, as always, would be written in the stars.